Of all the minor creatures of mythology, fairies are the most beautiful, the most numerous, the most memorable. So says Andrew Lang in his 1910 entry for the Encyclopedia Britannica. Lang's perspective was shared by many Victorian and Edwardian authors, lending these beings a long-lived cultural currency and relative durability, even during the First World War. Today I will briefly compare the Edwardian-era fairy books of Rudyard Kipling and J.R.R. Tolkien, works far more complex than that label suggests. Kipling's understudied and now nearly forgotten Puck of Pook's Hill, 1906, and its sequel, Rewards and Fairies, 1910, and Tolkien's Book of Lost Tales, 1917 to 1919, were products of the previous century's fascination with myth, medievalism, and folklore, all branches of an integrative movement enamored with imagined or reimagined pasts. In this scheme, the fairy-themed literature of Kipling and Tolkien have varied relationships to what the latter later called feigned history. As historical fantasy, Kipling's books lie somewhere between the feigned and the real, while Tolkien's fit more squarely into that category. Kipling, to an extent, mythologizes history, while Tolkien does something like the opposite, historicizing myth. In their distinct ways, both authors recognize the potency of weaving myth and history together, using fairies as a bridge between the two. Better known for his Jungle Books, Kipling turned to a different sort of fantasy in his two fairy books, each a collection of stories encased in a framed narrative and interleaved with poems or songs topical to each tale. In these, the fairy Puck either personally narrates or introduces historical figures who do so, Roman centurions, Saxon and Norman knights, Tudor artisans, and political leaders, royal and otherwise, who all relate their experiences of key moments in English history to two children, Una and Dan, who have accidentally summoned Puck while performing A Midsummer Night's Dream in a fairy ring at midsummer. Una and Dan are modeled after Kipling's own children, Elsie and John, the latter killed in the First World War in 1915 at the Battle of Loos, while the frame narrative is set in Edwardian-era Sussex, where the Kipling family had settled. Puck is a purveyor of local legends, but also the living connection between myth and modernity, with memories reaching back into the island's prehistory, as the self-proclaimed oldest old thing in England, an idea replicated in Tom Bombadil's naming himself eldest in Fellowship of the Ring. He remembers the arrival and departure of the so-called people of the hills, a catch-all term for a heterogeneous mixture of beings which includes the old gods and various creatures of folklore, who, like the changing human invaders, could never permanently monopolize or control the island. Although generally regarded as children's literature, the contents of the first book, Puck of Pook's Hill, were serialized in the Strand magazine and other periodicals aimed at adults. Despite the book's initially tepid reception, due to associations of Kipling, in one early reviewer's words, as a missionary of empire, nonetheless these were often reprinted and have enjoyed fruitful scholarly reassessments in recent years. Various elements from the Puck books leave their traces in Tolkien's narratives and characters, especially in the works composed closest in time to Kipling's, the Book of Lost Tales, edited and published in the 1980s by Tolkien's son and literary executor, Christopher. Due to the manner of their collation, like the Puck books, the never-completed Lost Tales, augmented with notes and story outlines in Christopher's accompanying commentaries, some of which are drawn from here, are also an anthology of prose narratives interspersed with thematically related poetry that Tolkien had composed between 1914 and 1916. Like Kipling's, these tales are linked together by a framed narrative, this time with a much thinner link to history. Oriel, a mortal wanderer of Germanic origin from the continent, according to implications from Tolkien's notes, this would be the Danish peninsula, sails west to the island of Tolaresia, or the Lonely Isle, where the fairies dwelt, initially conceived as prehistoric England, before the Anglo-Saxon invasions. There he encounters the inhabitants of the cottage of lost play, where feasting and storytelling are the main activities. In an amplification of the Puck-Dan-Una dynamic, here numerous fairy narrators recount stories of their distant past to a host of mortal children, apparently transfers from another magical cottage in the land of the gods, Valinor. Oriel hears accounts of the heroism and tragedy of the ancient elves/fairies, who in these tales are of human stature, the rise and fall of the fierce gemsmith Feanor, the destruction of the glorious elven city of Gondolin, the bittersweet love story of Beren and Luthien, and the harrowing tale of the anti-hero Turin Turambar, told by the island's oldest fairy inhabitants, and occasionally by some of the children. As with Puck, some of the fairy narrators have close contacts with the mythic legendary history they relate, like Littleheart, the son of a survivor from Gondolin named Bronweg. Did Tolkien read Puck of Pook's Hill and Rewards and Fairies, and if so, when exactly? Tom Shippey believes that he did, naming the two works in his chapter on Tolkien's sources in The Road to Middle-earth, while Dimitra Fimi has noted the influence of Kipling's Puck books on Tolkien's Lost Tales, without giving much consideration to the comparison in her monograph, Tolkien, Race and Cultural History, From Fairies to Hobbits. This suggests that Tolkien could have read one or both books in or before the 1910s, possibly while still at school. Parallels between Puck's list of long-since departed entities in Puck of Pook's Hill and Tolkien's own arriving ones in the tale The Coming of the Valar suggest possible early influence. In Kipling's account, Puck recalls, "The people of the hills have all left. I saw them come into Old England, and I saw them go. Giants, trolls, kelpies, brownies, goblins, imps, wood, tree, mound, and water spirits, heath people, hill watchers, treasure guards, good people, little people, pishoves, leprechauns, night riders, pixies, nixies, gnomes, and the rest. Gone, all gone." Tolkien's own taxonomy of beings accompanying the Valar, the quasi-angelic demiurgic guardians of the world created by the ruling god Iluvatar, runs along similar lines, embellishing the old with the new by adding his own nomenclature to the more established names of folk belief. About them, the Valar, fared a great host, who are the sprites of trees and woods, of dale and forest and mountainside, of those that sing amid the grass at morning and chant among the standing corn at eve. These are the Nurmir and the Tavari, Nandini and the Rossi, brownies, fays, pixies, laprons, and what else are they not called? For their number is very great. Yet must they not be confused with the Eldar, that's the elves, for they were born before the world and are older than its oldest, and are not of it, but laugh at it much. Notice how some of these names correspond with Kipling's, leprons merely a variant spelling of leprechauns. Even the gnomes in Puck's list, although absent from Tolkien's, are a prominent and powerful group of the elves or Eldar, referencing the Noldor or Noldali, as named in the Lost Tales. These are not the only connections between Kipling's and Tolkien's fairy books. Both connect child's play, storytelling, and magical ancient beings in their respective fairy circle and cottage of lost play, which become sites of the transmission of history. In these places, children are the main recipients of individual and collective memory and memorializing. Even Oriel takes on a childlike state by allowing himself to become magically smaller to enter the cottage. A key difference, while Puck constantly gives Una and Dan magic amnesia, so they forget the tales and their meetings with him, Oriel's role is to become a human recorder of the lost deeds of the oldest beings of prehistoric England's past. However, according to one story outline, he must record all he has heard before the drinking of Limpe, a drink that could either give eternal youth and or immortality, essentially assimilating a mortal with the elves, which suggests it could, like Puck's magical leaves of oak, ash, and thorn, also erase memories. Although technically a post-Edwardian product, the frame narrative of the Book of Lost Tales is like a last gasp of Edwardian fairy. The outgrowth of Tolkien's nostalgic fairy verse from 1914 onwards, the tales represent both a replication of and innovation on Victorian and Edwardian fairy literature. As the Proto-Silmarillion, these occupy a liminal position among Tolkien's writings, and in his presentation of the central beings of this mythic legendary cycle, the elves. Here the elves, also called fairies, appear as both the traditionally small beings that frequented the pages of so many poems, plays, and fairy tales of the period, and as the far grander ones of Norse and Irish myth, the Ljósa Álfar, or light elves, and the Tuatha De Danann, respectively, and other such representations in medieval romances like Sir Orfeo. The fairy/elves of Tolkien's frame narrative are diminished remnants of a once taller, mightier race, who now reside in a small magical cottage which larger folk can only enter by getting smaller, a bit like Alice in Alice in Wonderland. However, their ancestors, skilled artisans, and powerful warriors were human height, but with more slender frames. Kipling presents a bifocal view. He also presents a bifocal view of the fairy's size. Puck mocks the traditional Victorian quaintness of little buzzflies with butterfly wings and gauze petticoats and shiny stars in their hair, claiming these are unfamiliar to the wondrous, even terrifying people of the hills. I've seen Sir Huon and a troop of his people setting forth from Tintagel Castle for high Brazil in the teeth of a southwesterly gale, with the spray flying all over the castle and the horses of the hills wild with fright. Out they'd go in a lull, screaming like gulls, and back they'd be driven 5 good miles inland before they could come head to wind again. Butterfly wings. It was magic, magic as black as Merlin could make it, and the whole sea was green fire and white foam with mermaids in it. And the horses of the hills picked their way from one wave to another by the lightning flashes. That's how it was in the old days. Puck's contrast of the traditional images from children's fairy literature and the mythological forcefulness of the same beings riding the storm is also represented by Tolkien. Rather than dismissing the traditional Victorian style fairies, he provides a tragic explanation for their diminution and departure. In a story outline relating to the tales, Tolkien writes, after the Battle of Ross, which is a place equated with Brittany, the elves faded with sorrow. They cannot live in air breathed by a number of men equal to their own or greater, and ever as men wax more powerful and numerous, so the fairies fade and grow small and tenuous, filmy or transparent. At last men, or almost all, can no longer see the fairies. Yet even with this account, there are still the unfaded ones who live far away in Valinor, retaining their original majestic state. Another intriguing aspect of this passage is its reversal of a concept from Dymchurch Flit in Puckapook's Hill that cites the negative health impacts on humans when too many fairies multiply and reside in one location, a problem that accelerates the fairies' departure from England. For the final portion of this paper, I will examine Kipling's and Tolkien's use of the arrival and or departure of the fairies and or gods as a way of encoding historical relevance into myth. The themes of the fairies' departure from England has a long history dating back to Chaucer, whose Wife of Bath relates in her portion of the 14th century The Canterbury Tales. In the old days of King Arthur, of which the Britons specken great honour, all was this land fulfilled of fairy. I spec of many 100 years ago, but now no man can see none elves mo. Some 2 centuries later, Bishop Richard Corbett's poem, A Proper New Ballad, The Fairies' Farewell, makes similarly nostalgic reflections. Its first line, Farewell, Rewards and Fairies, became the title of Kipling's second fairy book, and its predecessor quoted the poem at length. The spirit of the poem's title and opening line is also revived and reimagined in the wistful melancholy of Tolkien's legendary and affiliated fairy verse from this time, as well as in the wider tragedy of the Book of Lost Tales. In her study of the reception of fairy lore and belief, Strange and Secret Peoples, Carol Silver observes, the fairies, never quite believed in, are always leaving, but never gone. Yet the threat of their imminent loss touched the Victorian and Edwardian temperamental affinity for the elegiac and nostalgic, and led to the recording of numerous laments for, and the collection of numerous accounts of, their passing, and a considerable discussion of the reasons for it. These key aspects of the nostalgic and elegiac are presented in Kipling's and Tolkien's endeavors, but more prominent in the latter. Both Kipling's and Tolkien's works connect the fairies' departure with human conflicts. In Dymchurch Flit, the fairies grow so anxious over the warfare in England between Catholic and Protestant factions during the Reformation, they decide to be ferried across the Channel to still Catholic France, where they will not be reckoned among the images. They are aided in this by two sons of a marsh woman, one mute, the other blind, so neither can bear witness to their preternatural cargo. Puck, disguised as Old Tom Shoesmith, recalls the rather pathetic sight, which markedly contrasts with the more vibrant vision of these beings cited earlier from the book's first tale, Wayland's Sword. Then I saw, I don't know how many of them, with their wives and children and valuables, all escapin' out of cruel old England. Silver you could hear clinkin' and little bundles hold down dunt on the bottom boards, apostles of little swords and shields ranklin'. So Puck is actually changing his register to a dialect English. He doesn't, of course, speak this way when he's Puck. Likewise, in story outlines and notes for projected but unfinished narratives, Tolkien imagined the fairies' departure as following a war with mankind in the Great Lands, originally conceived as akin to prehistoric Europe. In this schematic narrative, the elves/fairies would lose and have to retreat from Proto-Europe to Proto-England or Britain in a kind of mythic simulation of British soldiers returning to Blighty, or England, from northern France during the First World War. In the epilogue to Oriel's story, the conflict between men and elves reaches what would become England, with the latter group worsted in the fight and forced to flee abroad. Tolkien paints a much more visceral and traumatic picture of immortal refugees. And now sorrow has come upon the elves. Empty is Tabrabel, and that is not supposed to be Warwick. It is actually representing Great Haywood and Staffordshire, according to Tolkien. And now sorrow has come upon the elves. Empty is Tabrabel, and all are fled, fearing the enemy that sits on the ruined heath, who is not a league away, whose hands are red with the blood of elves and stained with the lives of his own kin, who has made himself an ally of Melko and the Lord of Hate, who has fought for the orcs and gongs and the unwholesome monsters of the world. Blind and a fool, and destruction alone is his knowledge. The paths of the fairies he has made to dusty roads. Along with its kinship with Kipling's account, this passage also evokes Rose Amy Fileman's 1918 poem, There Used to Be, that recalls how there used to be fairies in Germany before the war. That's the First World War. But now I fear that the fairies are dead. Intriguingly, she partially blames the fairies for their own demise in that country. In Fileman's and Tolkien's texts, human vice and cruelty not only create rifts between humanity and enchantment, but even causes mankind to murder their enchanted elders. Such examples also support the assertion in the book Victorian Fairy Painting that fairies could be used to make religious or political comment. All these texts had, at the very least, some historical topicality, if not reference or oblique allusion to the same. On this note, Kipling's fairy books are cogent reflections on the shifting tectonic plates of power and the ephemeral nature of empire. Even his people of the hills, something between ancient gods and powerful elementals or fairy-like beings, cannot maintain their power bases in England forever. Puck, as the last old thing, has seen many human and superhuman rulers come and go. In Wayland's Sword, he humorously puts the smith god's Wayland's arrogance in its place. Wayland's image, a big black wooden thing, lay in the bows of a black 32-oar galley. Bitter cold it was. There was ice on Wayland's lips. When he saw me, he began a long chant in his own tongue, telling me how he was going to rule England, and how I should smell the smoke of his altars from Lincolnshire to the Isle of Wight. I didn't care. I'd seen too many gods charging into old England to be upset about it. There is certainly an implied link between these gods charging into Old England and the ever-turning wheel of Roman, Saxon, Norman, and other rulers in Britain. In her book Empire's Children, Daphne Kutzer had suggested that Kipling more generally, especially in his Roman episodes, is giving the children of England an implicit warning that the British Empire itself may fall. Kutzer contextualizes themes of doomed empire in the Puck books in Kipling's own times, citing the Indian Mutiny of 1857 and the precarious Zulu War of 1879. In like manner, but still more potently, Tolkien's Lost Tales are deeply engraved with the wider historical tragedies of the Great War of 1914 to 18, a vast and unprecedentedly destructive military conflict. The First World War also marked an apocalyptic moment for kingdoms and empires, grim historical realities all memorably reenacted in Tolkien's own famed history. Kipling's and Tolkien's works rest on either side of the First World War. While anxiety over a dwindling British Empire began in earnest following Queen Victoria's death in 1901, even before this, Kipling's own poem Recessional, composed for her 1897 Diamond Jubilee, had raised the specter of the transience of British imperial power. In Tolkien's Lost Tales, started halfway through the war, the more hypothetical fears in Kipling's works are more dramatically actualized in the falls of elven kings like Turgon and Tinwelint, later Thingol, and in the dynastic catastrophe of the Noldor. The destruction of the main elven kingdoms of Gondolin, Artenor, later Doriath, and Proto-Nargothrond, not yet so named, through betrayal, revolution, war, and invasion, are mimetic of the meteoric fall of emperors, kings, and other potentates that accompanied the collapse of the German, Russian, Ottoman, and Austro-Hungarian empires in and around 1918. While the British Empire survived this war, the beginning of its decline had begun, and it is decline that has a monolithic presence in the Lost Tales. In the early 20th century, fears about the death of the old world had moved from fiction to reality. With Tolkien's narratives, reality is intentionally or unintentionally transformed into fiction. In Tolkien's mythology, the fairies, like men, can die, and their preternatural nature alone does not protect them from either their own failings or those of others. Like Kipling's Old Things, they too must depart, what Kipling at the start of Puck of Pook's Hill calls Merlin's Isle of Gramarye. Due to a brevity of time, I've had to offer only a quick whirlwind of connections, comparisons, and reflections on works that deserve much more scholarly assessment. I hope in due course to publish a longer study on this topic, but for now at least, to quote from Tolkien's epilogue of his Ariel story, I now must lay down the pen, and so of the fairies cease to tell. Thank you.